I'm Kim Bailey, she's Fuliana Osborne, and this is Inside Exec. We're continuing our conversation this week with Kevin Eikenberry, and we're covering how much risk and safety and trust you can have in your organisation and within your teams.
One of the things that we use that I thought was really good is different topics. So we'll have a get together even before the videos, things like the phone even. And as a group, we weren't talking about anything transactional, but we're talking about success sharing. What did your success look like? And people will just that. And another one was pure storytelling, like what you just did with the story with Tom Peters. So what we're doing is we're sharing information through interaction rather than transaction.
100%. So at the start of our monthly team meeting, just to be very practical here, the start of our monthly team meeting, so we meet as a whole team only once a month. I mean, at least on a scheduled sort of basis, right? And at the start of that meeting, and just to give everybody context, there's currently 13 of us. And so at the start of that meeting, I have some sort of very random question, right? That is somehow topical. I don't know. Like, I know what it was the other day, because the other day we had our meeting on National Oreo Day. Do you guys have Oreos?
We do.
Okay.
But they're not mainstream.
No.
Okay, well, so I said, okay, it's National Oreo Day. Here's the thing, everybody. You got 4 questions. Pick one of these 4 questions, and they were all Oreo related. And basically what happens is people tell a story. Like, where do Oreos, questions were like, do you have an Oreo story? What's your favorite kind of Oreo? Where do Oreos, because there's different flavors, right? In the U.S., there's like them. Where would Oreos rate on your favorite cookies? Kinds of, and then how do you eat them? Because some people pull them apart. So like I said, pick one of those things and tell us. And so everyone talks for like 45 seconds, a minute. There's laughter. We found out that some people could care less about Oreos. We found out some people it's their very favorite cookie on the planet. And in like 8 minutes, we'd had a laugh. We got an insight into each other. We had some new sort of fodder for just conversation. And then we got down to business. And that 8 minutes is as important as the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, I used to use it. A lot of my corporate life was in public speaking and teaching engineers and architects to speak better. And they were all pretty stiff. And the icebreaker
many of them, maybe not all, but most of them.
The icebreaker that I used for that, which was the most successful icebreaker I have ever used in 40 years of teaching public speaking, was to ask people if they had a middle name, what it was, how they got it, and if they had their choice, what would it be?
Anything but what it is. There's my answer.
My favourite is that I don't have one. So it was easy for me.
That's unfair. That's manipulating, making people tell their middle name, and you don't have to tell you.
What happens is that they all decide, by the end of the session, they'll all decide what my middle name should be. There's one I would like to have, but they decided on something else. But one of the most memorable time of that was we had an engineer who was Chinese born and bred and had come to this country as a migrant. He worked as a taxi driver, and he was just a phenomenal quality systems manager and a phenomenal brain. And he worked his way through so that he got to be able to use these other skills. But he told us, and no one knew. Everyone was afraid of him because they thought, he's the brains of the outfit. And this was an opportunity for them to find out something about him. And he said, well, my name is Stephen Wong. Obviously, Stephen is not my given name. I have a Chinese name. But when I came to this country and I was a taxi driver, I needed something that was an easy English-sounding name. And the only name that I knew in English was R.L. Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson. So being of Asian descent, he thought that Stevenson was the name that you gave people. And so he said, well, I just shortened it because Stevenson obviously was too long. So I just said, I'm Stephen. And that's what he became. And people were quite fascinated, not only with the story, but with the reasoning behind the story. And so it gives them, that, as Fuliana said, it's a different kind of information and education that you're imparting just by that easy exercise, that non-threatening exercise.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that. It's a great story.
And it led me to needing to read the complete works of Robert Louis Stevenson. And I am 90% through. We better move on to question 2. Question 2 is about risk focus. And this, once again, is as a result of some of the other guests we've had more recently that are talking about a change in management styles and leadership styles, and being, as you talked about yourself, more flexible in terms of our approach. So how can leaders use risk to drive teams forward, and should they?
Well, risk is a natural part of life, right? So I think what we want to do is we want to be clear as leaders about what risk means to us. And I think we want to be clear with our teams, much like we would as a parent. And I'm not saying that we should treat our teams as children. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that I believe that most parents want to intelligently expose our children to risks, right? Maybe not as physically risks, but risks, psychological risks, things to stretch us, to help us grow and move beyond our current comfort zone and all those sorts of things. So I'm using risk in sort of a lowercase r way here, right? And so I think that as a leader, we have to, number one, not shield our team from the realities of the world. Number two, I think that we have to intelligently offer them opportunities to do things that are risky, right? Including things like giving a speech, right? Speaking in front of the executive committee when they're a new leader, right? Or new supervisor or whatever. That's a risk as seen by that person. And so we've got to give people the chance to take risks, and we have to help them understand that it's in that risky time that is where growth can happen. Because if we stay in our comfort zone without risk, there will be no growth. And it really is an and, we have to provide the net too.
Yeah.
Right. There's been a lot of talk in the last 15 years about psychological safety. I'm talking about that right. So one of our clients for many years here in the U.S. was Cirque du Soleil. So for anyone who's listening, if you don't know who Cirque du Soleil is, but if you do, you do. And if you don't, think circus. Okay, for the purposes of this conversation. So if you're at a Cirque du Soleil show where there are people high in the air on bicycles or trampolines or trapezes or whatever they're on high in the air, there's a net. Now, they do a really good job of hiding it. Like, you have to really be paying attention or you won't see that it's there. But trust me, it's there. That net is there, number one, because it's an ethical thing. Like, we better have a net. Right. And there's a legal reason in the United States and everywhere else in the world. Here in the U.S., it would be called OSHA. But there's the government says you're going to have a net. Ethically, you're going to have a net. But you know what the third reason why the net is so important? Because the net gives us as an audience a better show. Because the risks are now manageable. So people will do 3 flips on the wire rather than 2, because they know that the worst thing that can happen is that they'll fall in the net. And so because of having the net, people will try more things. They will work a little harder. They will come closer to their potential. And so as a leader, it's our opportunity and responsibility to introduce, make people aware of, create opportunities for risk, and give them a net.
Yeah. Do you find with the organizations that you're working with, more recently, I guess, than over time, that safety net is not predominantly there?
No, I don't think with our clients, okay. I don't see that. I don't know that I see that. I think that it's generally good news that we talk more about things like psychological safety than we did 15 years ago. And so, no, my first reaction to your question is no, I don't think so, at least not with our clients.
Yeah.
Was there something specifically you were looking for there? I'm just curious.
We do case studies when we have our listeners send in something that they're struggling with. And we seem to have a thread of them in the last few years where people are concerned about taking an action because they don't feel like they're in a safe environment. They don't feel like they're in a trusting environment, I guess, is probably closer to the mark. I just wondered whether you'd seen that.
So I would say, yeah. So I'm glad I asked the follow-up, because I think there's something there that's worth us talking about for a second. And that is that I think that people are more willing to ask that question or to think about that than they would have been 20 years
Yeah.
ago. I'm not sure there's actually less safety than there was before, but I think the bar of what people are expecting is higher.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think it will certainly resonate with our listeners and give them something to think about, because we have struggled to try and find a way to explain to them that perhaps it's their perception of where they are because they're under stress about the idea of those sorts of things. And we had a case study very recently where a fellow had an idea that he knew was going to be an industry disruptor, and he didn't feel comfortable about bringing it up in his own organisation. But that's all he told us. And so we had all these questions about, well, why don't you want to bring it up? What's the stumbling block?
I would say two things. One is, if you're a person that's not feeling safe, I acknowledge that that's how you feel. That's the first thing. And I would encourage you to think, what's truly the worst thing that would happen if you shared it? I think that sometimes we catastrophize things, or we make assumptions about what will happen that may or may not be true. And I would say to you, if you're a leader and you're saying in your head, well, that wouldn't happen in my organization, it's possible that it would. And even if you're saying, I wouldn't even roll my eyes, I want to hear that, you need to acknowledge the fact that that could be how people feel. And so that perception difference is important. And so that becomes something that we as leaders can then work on. Like, how do we continue to build trust at a higher level so that people do feel comfortable? And it does mean that whenever little things happen, we can't roll our eyes and we can't, sort of do anything that would even be misconstrued, right, as being unsafe. And I think it's a really important point. And I think that I would just say this to people on both sides of that. And that is that what we're experiencing isn't necessarily what others are experiencing.
And we all have our own filter. Yep.
And so spend a little time thinking about it from the other perspective and ask yourself, well, what could it be? What might it be? I call this plausible cause analysis. Or even to this point of like, well, what am I worried about happening if I share this industry disruptive idea? Am I worried they're going to take it? Am I worried they're going to laugh? Am I worried I'm going to get fired? Like, what is it that I'm worried about? Right. And is that thing, even if that worst thing happens, what happens next? And it might not be as bad as you think, as we have it in our head. I always tell people, thoughts are fuzzy, words bring clarity. So whatever we've got in our head, if we can just tell somebody, tell our dog, write it down, like get it into words, and then say, well, that's not near as big of a deal as I thought it would be.
Earlier when you were talking, and then again in this response, that reaction of people not feeling like they're safe because they're talking to someone who rolls their eyes and all the rest of it, does it come back to, and we've talked about this ad infinitum over the years, communicating core values? So going back to having our strong roots, particularly, I think we struggle, we seem to get questions about communicating core values for an organisation where it is a remote workforce. How do we communicate it, first of all? How do we reinforce it when it's not the little plaque on the wall that they see every day when they walk in the door?
Well, that has nothing to do with it, by the way. The plaque on the wall has nothing. Our values our actions show the values. So the way we communicate the values is make sure that our actions are in alignment with those things that we profess to be our values. Because people are watching our feet, not our lips, even remotely. Like when we respond to emails, do we respond to emails, how we respond to emails. Like isn't just whether they see us walking up and down the hallway in the office. Like people watch our feet, our actions, more than our lips, our words. And so ultimately to me, you could say, well, this is a safe environment, but if people don't feel it, then it isn't safe, right? Now, their perception might not be reality. I understand that. But that becomes the place that we have to try to work through together, right? If that's true, if that's how people are feeling.
And so if they feel like it's not a safe environment, they're working remotely, do you bring them in to address that so that they're all in the same room on the same, so that they can get the physical reactions as well as the words?
So let's say it this way. It all depends. It depends on lots of things, including like how far people away are from each other. Like, and at this point, we're fundamentally talking about a level of, are we talking about this in terms of I need to coach you about your behavior because it's not matching the values, then the question is, can we coach at a distance? Of course we can, right? I definitely think we want our cameras on, if at all possible, because the richer the communication that we can have, the better chance we can have of it being successful. And cameras on is the next best thing to being face-to-face, right? It's not the same, but it's the next best thing. And so, if it's around coaching, I mean, I would say this, if timing and logistics allow for people to come in, then that probably makes some sense. But here's the other side to that. I'll use a slightly different example. I had a team member for several years, she's retired about a year ago, who didn't, and we were using webcams like way before the pandemic, right? She didn't like using her webcam. And she was in a situation where she didn't always have really good bandwidth. So there was valid reasons for the video issue, and there was some personal reasons for the video issue. So I granted her some grace around that. And sometimes she and I would just have a phone call rather than getting on camera, right? But she knew that sometimes I wanted us to be on camera, right? I decided that I wasn't going to mandate that she needed to be on all the time, because there was also this bandwidth issue some of the time. So I said, we will be on camera some of the time, but not all the time. Here's the place to be careful. I couldn't make the times we were going to be on camera only be the times when I had something that was going to be harder or challenging to say, because then the camera was like a trigger. So I didn't want that. So sometimes I'd say, hey, look, we haven't been on camera, well, let's just be on camera. And it would be a lovely, wonderful conversation. There's no conflict. There's no emotion. There's no negative coaching, like none of that stuff, right? But if I really needed that, I did make sure that was there. But I didn't want her to feel like it was only then. So should we bring people in? Yeah, maybe. But maybe we can't, because they're halfway around the world, right? And so then we've definitely got to make the communication as rich as we can. And the richest we can have is face-to-face across the table, right? Face-to-face, nose-to-nose, toes-to-toes, if you will. But the next best thing is what we're doing right now, which is on camera.
We'll take a break in our conversation with Kevin Eikenberry. Join us for part 3, the final part of this conversation. For now, I'm Kim Bailey, she's Fuliana Osborne, and this is Inside Exec.